The schematic display on Kale's scanner flickered for the third time in as many minutes, which meant he was either approaching a concentrated gravitational anomaly, or the Voltorian palace architects had decided that consistent spatial geometry was for species without imagination. He'd been working in the lower mechanical levels of the royal palace for 2 weeks now, long enough to accept that doors occasionally opened onto rooms that his instruments insisted didn't exist, and that the ductwork sometimes hummed in frequencies that made his teeth ache in ways the safety briefing definitely hadn't mentioned. The environmental regulation contract had seemed straightforward when he'd signed it back on the orbital station. Upgrade the palace climate systems, avoid offending anyone important, collect hazard pay generous enough to fund 6 months of not working in places where gravity negotiated terms. What the contract hadn't mentioned was that Voltorian architecture operated on principles that made his engineering training feel like suggestions rather than laws, or that he'd spend most of his shifts alone in access corridors that twisted in directions his inner ear couldn't quite process. Kale preferred the solitude. Fewer opportunities for the kind of diplomatic incidents that happened when maintenance workers from Earth didn't realize that commenting on someone's ear articulation could be either a compliment or grounds for ritual combat. Depending on context, his cultural briefing had covered for approximately 40 seconds. Better to stay in the mechanical spaces where the only beings he interacted with were coolant pumps and air recyclers that didn't care about proper forms of address. The schematic indicated that Junction Point 7 should be accessible through the access panel ahead, a routine inspection of the water reclamation system that he'd performed a dozen times in other palace sections. He approached the panel, noting absently that this corridor seemed unusually well appointed for a maintenance access. The walls were polished stone rather than exposed infrastructure, and the lighting had a quality that suggested someone had actually considered aesthetics rather than just illumination. Possibly he was closer to the residential sections than the schematic indicated, which wouldn't surprise him given how often his scanner disagreed with palace geography. Kale pressed his authorization chip against the panel reader and waited for the standard 3-second delay. Instead, the panel dissolved immediately into a shimmering barrier that his scanner identified as an environmental membrane, which was excessive security for a water junction, but perhaps the Voltorians took their plumbing seriously. He stepped through, already mentally cataloging the expected configuration of pipes and filtration nodes. The steam hit him first, warm and fragrant with something that made him think of the botanical gardens on the station's recreation level. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, and he realized he wasn't looking at pipes. He was looking at a chamber of dark stone and water where someone was very definitely bathing. And that someone had white skin that seemed to generate its own luminescence in the half-light, blonde hair pinned up in an elaborate configuration that suggested patience and privacy, and long ears that swept back from her head in the elegant points that every cultural briefing identified as the primary visible distinction of Voltorian physiology. For approximately 3 heartbeats that felt like geological epochs, Kale's brain simply refused to process information. Then several facts arrived simultaneously. He was standing in someone's private bath. That someone was naked. Those elaborate hairpins suggested this wasn't a public facility. And the environmental barrier he just stepped through was probably not meant to be opened with a maintenance authorization chip from a discount contractor. The woman in the bath, and some distant, still-functioning portion of Kale's mind, noted the scarring across her shoulders visible above the waterline, turned to look at him with an expression that cycled through surprise, disbelief, and something else he couldn't identify before his survival instincts finally activated. "I am so sorry," Kale stammered, already turning back toward the panel. "Wrong junction, faulty schematic, I'll just close it." Her voice was calm, which somehow made everything worse. Kale froze with one hand reaching toward the environmental barrier. "Close it from inside," she clarified. "The door, Close it and stay. This was not a situation covered in any safety briefing Kale had ever received. He turned slightly, carefully keeping his eyes focused on the ceiling architecture, which he now noticed featured carved patterns that probably cost more than his entire contract. "Your Majesty, I should really—" He stopped, his brain catching up with what his mouth was saying. "Your Majesty." The white skin, blonde hair, and the kind of elaborate ear jewelry that his briefing had mentioned exactly once as being reserved for the highest nobility. He just walked in on Queen Thessara. He just walked in on the sovereign of Voltoria Prime while she was bathing. He was going to die, probably ceremonially. "You've already seen," she said, and there was something in her tone that wasn't anger. "Closing it from the other side doesn't change that. So close it from inside, and we'll discuss what happens next." Kale's hand moved to the panel control, some deeply ingrained instinct to follow instructions from authority, overriding the part of his brain screaming that staying was worse than fleeing. The environmental barrier shimmered back into solidity, sealing him inside the bath chamber with a woman who ruled several billion beings, and who he'd just seen naked, because his schematic was apparently 40 renovations out of date. "I have a really good excuse," Kale said to the ceiling. "It's not a good excuse, but it's all I have. Outdated schematic, faulty scanner, and apparently your environmental barriers accept maintenance authorization codes when they probably shouldn't." "Look at me," Queen Thessara said. "I'd really prefer not to, Your Majesty. I'm not asking you to examine me. I'm asking you to look at me because we're having a conversation, and in every culture I'm aware of, that works better with eye contact." Kale reluctantly lowered his gaze, carefully focusing on her face and nothing else. She was watching him with an expression he slowly recognized as calculation, like she was solving an equation with too many variables. "You saw the scarring," she said. "Not a question." "I saw the door I shouldn't have opened," Kale said carefully. "Everything after that was pure survival reflex and architectural panic." "But you saw it, my shoulders, upper arms. You saw before you realized where you were." Kale wanted to lie, wanted to claim he'd been too busy panicking to notice anything, but something in her expression suggested that lies would make this worse. "Yes, I saw scarring. I also saw that I'd made the kind of mistake that usually ends with memory extraction and a permanent ban from orbital contracts, so I was fairly distracted." She was quiet for a moment, her long ears tilting slightly forward in what Kale's briefing had identified as concentration or consideration. "How much do you know about Voltorian politics?" "Enough to know that walking in on the Queen bathing is probably not covered by standard workplace insurance." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Before today, had you heard anything about an assassination attempt 3 years ago?" Kale's stomach dropped. Assassination attempt. The scarring suddenly made terrible sense. "No, but I'm maintenance crew, Your Majesty. I hear about broken air recyclers and coolant leaks, not state secrets." "Good." She seemed to relax slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. "That means the concealment worked. That means you're the first person outside my private physicians to see evidence that someone nearly killed me, and that I survived with marks that couldn't be fully healed." "I won't tell anyone," Kale said immediately. "I'll sign whatever confidentiality agreements you want, submit to verification scans, accept memory alteration if—" "Memory alteration is unreliable," she interrupted, "and tends to spread secrets rather than contain them when it fails. Confidentiality agreements are meaningless if someone decides to extract information by force, and verification scans just tell me you're sincere right now, not that you'll stay sincere when someone offers you enough credits or threatens your family." Kale felt his throat tighten. "So what happens now?" Queen Thessara studied him for a long moment, and Kale had the distinct impression he was being evaluated according to criteria he didn't understand. "Now," she said finally, "you stand there looking profoundly uncomfortable while I explain why what you've accidentally learned matters, and we determine whether the human who entered my bath with a faulty schematic can be trusted with a secret that could destabilize my reign if it reaches the wrong ears. Kale had spent the last 40 minutes learning more about Voltorian political theory than any maintenance technician should reasonably know, and he was fairly certain his understanding of power dynamics would never recover. Queen Thessara had explained, with remarkable patience for someone conducting a classified briefing while naked in a bath, that Voltorian sovereignty operated on principles of perceived invulnerability, that showing weakness was essentially abdicating the throne in slow motion, and that visible scars from an assassination attempt would be interpreted by her court as proof that she could be killed, and therefore should be replaced by someone more difficult to stab. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Kale said, still maintaining careful eye contact with her face and absolutely nothing else. "You survived someone trying to murder you, which should logically make you look incredibly difficult to kill, but instead it makes you look killable because you have scars proving you bled." "The scars prove someone got close enough to try," she said. "Close enough to nearly succeed. In Voltorian politics, that proximity is the problem. It suggests my security failed, my awareness failed, my instincts failed. It suggests vulnerability. With respect, Your Majesty, that's completely insane." Her ears tilted back slightly, an expression Kale suspected meant surprise. "You're aware you're criticizing the fundamental principles of my government while trapped in my bath chamber." "I'm aware I'm probably going to die regardless of what I say, so I might as well be honest. Your political system punishes you for surviving attempted murder. That's not governance, that's collective delusion with extra steps." She laughed, an actual surprised sound that echoed off the stone walls. "You know, in 3 years, no one has pointed out that it's absurd. They've all accepted it as natural law. That's because everyone else at court is probably invested in maintaining the system. I fix air recyclers. I have no stake in pretending your politics make sense." Kale shifted his weight, hyper-aware of the coolant fluid he was dripping onto what was probably irreplaceable flooring. "Can I ask why you're telling me all this, instead of just having security memory wipe me and dump me on the next transport off-planet? Because you've already seen the scars, which means the damage is done, and now I'm calculating whether containing you is safer than eliminating the information." She said it with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss maintenance schedules. Memory alteration fails approximately 8% of the time, and when it fails, it typically creates false memories that are more problematic than the original. People who have been improperly wiped tend to become suspicious, paranoid, and very talkative about the gaps in their memory. Killing you would require explaining why a human maintenance worker died in the palace, which invites investigation. Having you arrested for breach of security would require public charges, which creates records and questions. "So I'm alive because murder would be inconvenient," Kale said. "That's comforting in a deeply disturbing way." "You're alive because I'm making a calculation about trust," she corrected. "I'm evaluating whether the human who stumbled into my bath with a faulty schematic might be more useful as someone who knows my secret than as a problem to eliminate." Kale felt his pulse accelerate. "Useful how? Do you know how long it's been since I could have an honest conversation with someone?" She shifted in the water, and Kale immediately redirected his gaze back to the ceiling. 3 years of hiding these scars means 3 years of performing invulnerability every moment someone can see me. 3 years of calculated appearances, strategic wardrobe choices, and ensuring I'm never vulnerable in any public or semi-public space. 3 years of being alone with a secret that I can't share because sharing it ends my reign. "That sounds exhausting," Kale said, then immediately worried that sympathy might be offensive to royalty. "It's isolating," she said quietly. "And now you know. You've seen what I've been hiding, and you're still standing here asking questions instead of trying to leverage the information. You called my political system insane, which suggests either profound stupidity or the kind of honesty that comes from not having a survival strategy. Definitely the second one, Kale confirmed. I stopped having a survival strategy when I opened the wrong door. So here's my proposition, Queen Thessara said. You keep the secret because telling anyone would get us both killed, me politically, you probably literally. But you also become someone I can talk to honestly. Someone who knows what I'm hiding and doesn't treat me like I'm made of porcelain and propaganda. Kale processed this. You want me to be your secret confidant because I accidentally saw you naked. I want you to be someone who knows the truth because everyone else in my life requires me to lie constantly, and I'm tired of pretending I'm invulnerable when I have scars that still ache when the atmospheric pressure changes. She paused. Also, you made me laugh, which hasn't happened in a policy meeting in approximately 2 years. Your Majesty, I appreciate that you're not having me killed, but I'm a maintenance technician. I don't know anything about court politics or how to be a confidential advisor to. I have hundreds of political advisors, she interrupted. They're all brilliant, strategic, and absolutely committed to maintaining the fiction of my perfection. What I don't have is anyone who can look at my government and say it's insane with extra steps. Kale couldn't help smiling. When you put it that way, I'm uniquely qualified. Can you keep the secret? She asked directly. Not because you signed an agreement or because you're afraid of consequences, but because you understand that telling anyone would hurt someone who's already been hurt enough. The question hit differently than Kale expected. He thought about power and isolation, about surviving something that should have killed you and having to hide the evidence, about being surrounded by people who needed you to be perfect while you were just trying to heal. Yes, he said. I can keep it, but can I ask something? You've already asked approximately 15 things, but continue. Does anyone else know? Not about the scars, understand you've hidden those. But does anyone know that you're hiding something this big? Do you have anyone you can talk to without performing? Her expression shifted, something cracking around the edges of her careful composure. No. The physicians who treated me are under binding confidentiality that would destroy their lives if broken. My security chief knows there was an attempt, but not the extent of the injuries. Everyone else sees what I show them, which is a queen who's never been touched by anything that could hurt her. That's not sustainable, Kale said. Humans would call that a breakdown waiting to happen. I don't know Voltorian psychology, but I'm guessing pretending you're invulnerable while hiding evidence of near death has a shelf life. Which is why, Queen Thessara said, I'm making you an offer that probably violates every security protocol my advisors would recommend. You keep my secret, and in exchange, you become the person who knows the truth. Someone I can talk to honestly about the weight of hiding vulnerability while projecting strength. Someone who accidentally learned what nobody should know and decided that mattered more than leverage. Kale stood in the bath chamber, dripping coolant onto priceless stone, and made a decision that would probably define the rest of his life. All right, I'll be your secret confidant, Your Majesty, but I have one condition. Her ears tilted forward with interest. A maintenance technician is negotiating with the Queen of Voltoria Prime. You're asking me to help you bear a secret that's been crushing you for 3 years. The least you can do is stop calling yourself invulnerable in private. I've seen the scars, remember. You're human enough to bleed. He paused. Well, Voltorian enough to bleed. You know what I mean. She smiled, genuine and unguarded. I accept your condition. Now please leave before someone discovers we've been having classified conversations while you stare at my ceiling and gradually puddle onto my floor. 3 weeks after accidentally becoming the Queen's confidant, Kale found himself in a service corridor behind the palace's central hydroponic gardens, ostensibly checking atmospheric exchange rates while actually waiting for Queen Thessara to arrive through the maintenance access she discovered allowed her to move through the palace without security tracking her every step. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same architectural chaos that had led him into the royal bath was now enabling secret meetings between a sovereign and a technician who'd signed up to fix air recyclers, not become a repository for classified emotional labor. The panel shimmered and she stepped through, still wearing the formal robes from whatever court function she'd just escaped. Her ears were decorated with the elaborate jewelry that signified she'd been conducting official business, probably something tedious involving trade agreements or territorial disputes that required her to project absolute certainty while pretending her shoulders didn't ache from old wounds. "Tell me something ridiculous happened today," she said without preamble. "I've spent 4 hours negotiating mineral rights with ambassadors who think pausing for dramatic effect constitutes strategy, and I need to remember that the universe contains absurdity beyond politics." Kale grinned. "I got called to fix what the work order described as a critical failure in the East Wing climate control. Turned out one of the junior nobles had modified his quarters to simulate a desert environment, because he'd read that thermal stress improves meditation. He'd bypassed 17 safety protocols and created a localized weather system that was bleeding heat into 3 adjacent rooms. When I explained that he'd essentially built a sauna that was cooking his neighbors, he asked if I could make it hotter. Did you? I told him that if he wanted to meditate in an environment hot enough to liquefy his furniture, he should book time in the industrial furnaces on sublevel 9, and that I'd be happy to provide directions. Kale paused. He reported me to palace administration for insufficient respect, but the complaint got dismissed because apparently this isn't the first time he's tried to modify his quarters into a hazard zone. Thessara laughed, the sound echoing off the corridor walls. "Lord Thurin. He once flooded his previous rooms trying to install an aquatic meditation chamber. We had to relocate him after he created what the repair crews called an indoor lake with delusions of spirituality." Your nobility is a constant argument against the idea that wealth correlates with intelligence. Wait until you hear about Lady Maris, who insisted we install gravitational dampeners in her quarters because she wanted to experience weightlessness during sleep, then couldn't understand why she kept waking up on the ceiling with no memory of how she got there. Thessara's expression softened slightly. "Thank you. I needed to laugh about something that wasn't structured into a political calculation." They'd fallen into this pattern over the past weeks, stolen conversations in overlooked corners of the palace, where a queen and a maintenance worker could talk without pretense. Kale had learned that Thessara preferred these brief exchanges to formal meetings, that she valued humor over sympathy, and that she asked his opinion on matters that had nothing to do with environmental systems because he was the only person in her life who had no political agenda beyond keeping the air recyclers functional. "How was the negotiation actually?" Kale asked, beyond the dramatic pausing. "Exhausting. The Corvin delegation wanted concessions I can't give without looking weak to the domestic council, who are already questioning why I've been more accommodating in recent trade discussions. Apparently my willingness to consider compromise instead of dictating terms suggests I'm losing my edge." She adjusted one of the ear ornaments absently. "I'm being criticized for the same diplomatic flexibility that 3 months ago they praised as strategic brilliance. The political calculus shifts faster than I can track it." "Because they're watching for signs you're vulnerable," Kale said. "Everything becomes evidence when people are looking for weakness." "Exactly. Which means I have to recalibrate constantly, projecting strength while still accomplishing actual governance, and it's—" She stopped, her ears tilting forward. "Someone's coming. Maintenance access 40 meters down." Kale immediately pulled out his scanner and began examining the atmospheric sensor panel with exaggerated focus. Thessara moved past him with the casual confidence of someone who had every right to inspect palace infrastructure, and by the time another technician rounded the corner, they were just a queen observing routine maintenance and a worker who was appropriately deferential. The other technician, Kale recognized him as part of the electrical systems crew, stopped and performed the formal gesture of respect that Volturians used for royalty. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the intrusion. Environmental maintenance reported activity in this corridor. I was reviewing the atmospheric exchange systems," Thessara said smoothly. "This corridor has been experiencing temperature fluctuations that concern me." Your colleague was explaining the cause. She glanced at Kale with the exact expression of polite expectation that royalty used when addressing service workers. "Pressure differential from the hydroponic systems," Kale said, falling into the role. "The gardens generate thermal variance that bleeds into adjacent corridors. It's within tolerance but noticeable if you're sensitive to environmental changes." The electrical technician nodded, apparently satisfied, and continued past them toward whatever repair had brought him to this section. After his footsteps faded, Thessara turned back to Kale with a slight smile. "We're getting better at this," she said quietly, "at lying to your employees about why the Queen is wandering maintenance corridors. At having moments of honesty in a life that requires constant performance." She adjusted her robes, preparing to return to whatever official functions awaited her. "I have another negotiation session in 20 minutes. More mineral rights, different ambassadors, same requirement that I appear absolutely certain while making decisions that could impact millions of lives based on incomplete information and political calculations that shift by the hour." "That sounds terrible," Kale said. "Want me to tell you about the time I had to explain to palace administration why the waste reclamation system in the guest wing was producing sounds that visiting dignitaries described as either haunted or digestive?" "Save it for next time," she said. "I need something to look forward to besides another formal dinner where I'll smile for 3 hours while people analyze whether I'm smiling enough but not too much, because apparently my expressions are now subject to committee review." "Your Majesty, permission to speak candidly." "You've been speaking candidly since you walked into my bath and called my political system insane. Continue." "Your court sounds exhausting. Your nobles are ridiculous. And the fact that you have to hide surviving an assassination attempt while simultaneously preventing your government from collapsing under the weight of its own absurd expectations makes me glad I just fix things that break in logical, predictable ways." Thessara's expression shifted to something almost affectionate. "You have no idea how valuable that perspective is. Everyone else in my life is invested in maintaining the system. You're the only person who can look at it from outside and confirm that it's as absurd as it feels from inside. Happy to provide external validation of internal chaos," Kale said. "It's probably not in my job description, but neither was becoming a confidential advisor to royalty, so I'm apparently expanding my skill set." She moved toward the panel that would take her back to the official palace corridors, back to the performance of invulnerability, and the weight of decisions that required her to appear certain while hiding doubt. Before stepping through, she paused. "Same time next week?" she asked. "I'm scheduled for maintenance review of the West Wing environmental systems. I'll make sure there's a plausible mechanical issue that requires extended consultation," Kale confirmed. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being someone who knows what I'm hiding and treats me like I'm still human anyway." "Volturian," Kale corrected with a slight smile. "You know what I mean." She stepped through the panel, leaving Kale alone in the service corridor with his scanner and the growing awareness that he'd accidentally become something more important than a maintenance technician. He'd become the person a queen could be honest with, and that responsibility felt heavier than any environmental system he'd ever repaired. The crisis arrived during Kale's 6th week as the Queen's unofficial confidant, which in retrospect was longer than anyone should expect to maintain a secret relationship with royalty without someone noticing patterns. Lord Kavrin, a political rival whose dedication to finding weakness in Thessara's reign apparently exceeded his interest in actual governance, had noticed that a human maintenance technician kept appearing in unusual palace locations, often shortly before or after the Queen happened to be in adjacent corridors. When security footage showed Kale in sections he had no maintenance authorization for, Kavrin made his accusation publicly during a council session that Thessara later described as impressively theatrical and comprehensively infuriating. Kale learned about it when palace security arrived at his quarters and informed him with professional courtesy that he was being detained pending investigation into potential espionage, which was several steps worse than getting fired and approximately one step short of getting memory wiped and deported. They escorted him to a holding chamber that was unsettlingly comfortable, furnished like a guest room rather than a cell, which suggested the authorities hadn't decided whether he was a criminal or just inconveniently informed. 2 hours later, Thessara arrived, still wearing formal council robes and looking like she'd been arguing for those entire 2 hours. The guards withdrew, leaving them alone in a room that was probably monitored by 17 different security systems. "Lord Kavrin is calling for your immediate interrogation and memory extraction," she said without preamble. "He's convinced you've been extracting state secrets, possibly at the direction of off-world interests, and that I've been compromised by either espionage or something more personally scandalous. He's making it a public challenge to my judgment, my security, and my fitness to rule." "Well," Kale said, "at least he's thorough in his accusations." "This isn't funny," she said, though her ears tilted in a way that suggested she appreciated the attempt. "If he forces memory extraction, they'll find everything. Our conversations, the bath chamber, the scars, all of it. The secret I've protected for 3 years gets exposed because someone noticed you have terrible authorization boundaries." To be fair, the authorization boundaries were terrible before I got here. I just took advantage of architectural chaos and outdated schematics. Kale leaned against the wall, trying to project calm he didn't feel. "What are our options? I can refuse the extraction, but that makes Kavrin's suspicions look justified. I can allow it and lose everything I've been hiding. I can have you deported immediately, which looks like I'm hiding something and sacrifices you to save myself. Or," she paused, her expression shifting to something calculating, "or I control the narrative before Kavrin does." "I don't like the sound of that or," Kale said. "The council meets again in 2 hours. Kavrin will push for your interrogation. I need to decide whether protecting you is worth the political cost of admitting why I care about protecting a maintenance technician who has no business being in half the places you've been." Kale felt something shift in his chest, a realization that they'd reached the point where their impossible arrangement collided with reality. "You shouldn't sacrifice your reign for me. That's not a reasonable trade." "You're the only person in this palace who treats me like I'm human," she said quietly. "That's worth more than you think. It's not worth your throne. Then help me find another option. Because I'm not letting Kavrin extract memories that prove I survived an assassination attempt and have been hiding evidence of vulnerability for 3 years. That information in his hands ends me politically." She began pacing, a habit Kale had learned meant she was calculating rapidly. "What if we admit part of the truth, not the scars, but the relationship? Confirm that you accidentally discovered something personal, that you've been discreet, and that Kavrin's accusations are political maneuvering rather than legitimate security concerns." "That still invites questions about what secret is worth protecting," Kale pointed out. "Which is why you're going to tell them," Thessara said, "in front of the council. You're going to admit you walked into the royal bath by accident, saw something you shouldn't have, and kept the confidence because it was the right thing to do, not because you were extracting intelligence." Kale stared at her. "You want me to tell your entire government that I saw you naked? I want you to tell them you saw evidence that I'm not invulnerable without specifying what that evidence was. Let them assume it's embarrassment rather than scars. Let them think the secret is personal rather than political." She stopped pacing, meeting his eyes directly. "And I'll confirm it. I'll own the narrative before Cavern can twist it into something worse. Your Majesty, that's risky, unprecedented, and probably violates every protocol for royal dignity, she finished. But it's better than memory extraction, better than letting Cavern control the story, and better than sacrificing you to maintain a fiction of perfection that's been exhausting me for 3 years. 2 hours later, Kale stood in front of the Voltorian High Council, surrounded by nobles whose ear jewelry probably cost more than his entire contract, and explained that he'd opened the wrong access panel, walked into the royal bath, and seen something the Queen had been keeping private. He kept it factual, slightly embarrassed, and completely honest about the accident that had started everything. Lord Cavern seized on it immediately. And what exactly did you see that warranted weeks of secret meetings and unauthorized access to restricted palace sections? Before Kale could answer, Thessara stood. He saw evidence that I'm capable of being surprised, embarrassed, and human enough to value privacy. He also proved capable of discretion, which is apparently a rarer quality among my court than I'd hoped. With respect, Your Majesty, Cavern said, and his tone suggested he had no respect whatsoever. A secret worth this much protection suggests something more compromising than embarrassment. You're right, Kale said, surprising himself. It does suggest something more. It suggests that your queen survived something that should have killed her, and instead of celebrating that survival, your political system treats it like weakness. I saw evidence that she's been hurt, that she's healed, and that she's strong enough to hide pain that would break most people while still ruling successfully. If you think that's compromising rather than impressive, then maybe the problem isn't her scars, it's your politics. The council chamber erupted in murmurs. Thessara let them continue for exactly 3 seconds before speaking. 3 years ago, there was an assassination attempt. I survived with injuries that my physicians could treat functionally but not cosmetically. I've hidden the scarring because our political system interprets survival as vulnerability rather than strength. Because showing evidence of being hurt apparently matters more than showing evidence of continuing to rule effectively despite being hurt. She looked directly at Cavern. The human who accidentally learned this secret has proven more loyal in 6 weeks than some nobles who have served for years. He's protected information that could destroy me politically, without seeking advantage, without leverage, without anything except the apparently revolutionary idea that surviving attempted murder while maintaining governance deserves discretion rather than exploitation. You've been hiding vulnerability, Cavern said, seizing on the admission. You've been deceiving the court about your physical condition, about your security failures. I've been surviving, Thessara interrupted, while hiding evidence of survival because our system punishes queens for bleeding. If you want to challenge my fitness to rule, Lord Cavern, challenge my actual governance. My trade agreements, my diplomatic successes, my economic policies. But if you're basing your challenge on the fact that someone tried to kill me and failed, then you're proving exactly why I had to hide the attempt in the first place. The council debated for another hour, but Kale could see the calculation shifting. Thessara had controlled the narrative, admitted vulnerability while framing it as strength, and made Cavern's accusations look like exploitation rather than legitimate concern. When the vote came, the council declined to pursue charges against Kale or to demand his memory extraction, though several nobles looked profoundly uncomfortable with the revelation that their queen had been hiding scars for 3 years. Later, in a private corridor far from council chambers, Thessara found Kale completing actual maintenance work on an air recycler. "We survived," she said. "You survived," Kale corrected. "I just stood there and gave an incredibly awkward speech about how your political system is collectively delusional. You defended me," she said. "You told them I was strong for hiding pain, not weak for being hurt. You gave me a narrative that reframes survival as strength instead of liability. Is it working, the reframing? Too early to tell. Some of the council will use this against me. Others are recalculating now that they know I survived an assassination attempt and maintained rule despite injuries they didn't detect. The politics will shift. She managed a slight smile. But I'm not hiding anymore. That's worth something. What happens to us? Kale asked. The secret confidant arrangement becomes complicated when the secret is partially public. Then we become something else. Maybe just a queen and a maintenance technician who met in the most absurd circumstances possible and proved that accidentally learning secrets can lead to actual trust. She adjusted one of her ear ornaments, a gesture Kale had learned meant she was thinking carefully. I still need someone who will tell me my political system is insane. That job opening remains available. Kale smiled. I accept. But I'm also going to fix this air recycler, because some of us still have actual work to do beyond maintaining elaborate fictions. Fair enough, Thesara said, and for the first time since Kale had accidentally walked into her bath, she looked like someone who wasn't carrying quite so much weight alone.